Hi everyone, welcome to Naturehood Live. My name's Kez and I'm a freshwater research assistant at Earthwatch. And this is my first ever Facebook Live video, so please be kind. First I'm going to talk to you about ponds. And if you saw the earlier Penhill page, you might have seen the post about ponds and how important they are and how they're completely disappearing from our landscape. So we've lost about 500,000 different kinds of ponds. You might also have seen Chloe's wonderful video on our Wild Days page about all the different animals that need water in our gardens. And ponds in your garden are a really, really fantastic way to provide water to lots of different species. One, there's lots of animals that actually live in the pond, and in a second I'm going to do a little live pond dipping video for you to show you the kind of things that I've got in my pond here. But there's also lots of other animals that will use your pond, things like birds, pollinators. You'll have bees that might like to come to the shallower areas and drink. Lots of different animals, even mammals if you've got things like hedgehogs and badgers around. So ponds are a really important water source for lots of animals. And they're also a breeding ground. You might have come across frogs and newts, and they both need ponds to breed, but also lots of insects, different life stages of flies and things will use ponds to breed in. So there's always tons and tons of life, and you don't need a huge fancy pond like the one I've got here. This is quite a big pond. I've got a nice little sort of emergent habitat, what we scientists like to call, which is where there's no water but it's very boggy, and I've also got some deep water here. But any kind of pond can provide water for something. And as you may know, if you're a very keen Earthwatch fan, water is a very limited resource, especially fresh water like this. It's really, really a small amount that we have available to us and available to animals to drink. So, without further ado, I'm going to start with a little pond dipping exercise and see if I can find some fun stuff to show you. So first I'm going to take a little sample of water from my pond. This is really important that you don't use tap water if you are ever playing about in your pond, because the animals that live there really won't like that. There's too many chemicals and things that they can't deal with, and they're much better off with the water chemistry that they're used to, which is the water that they're living in. So I've got a very wonderful professional pond net here, but basically anything will do if you want to explore your own pond. It's pretty easy to get in, and they're one of the first things that I connected with as a child, and one of the reasons I got into freshwater science in the first place was that I grew up with this pond. This is my family's pond, and I spent so much time in this pond as a child. I cannot tell you, so I'm very well versed with this pond. So we'll see what we can find. So when you look at a pond, there's lots and lots of different habitats here. We've got the deep water, we've got the kind of open water, we've got these areas at the side and the plants, and they all create different kinds of habitats for the things that live here. So I'm going to find different animals living in all of the different areas. Even from where I sit here, I can see some pond skaters on the surface, I can see some newts floating about in the middle, I can even see some little tiny water crickets that are also on the surface from here. So even before I put my net in, I can already see quite a lot of life. And of course the wonderful plants that I have growing here as well, which I'll tell you more about in a second. So I'm just going to sweep through a few of these different habitats. Got a little bit in the sort of areas where the plants are growing. I went right down the scoop to the bottom, and then I'm going to scoop about a bit in the open water column. See what I can get, and then I'm going to ask my very lovely assistant to bring the camera over here, and I can show you what I've caught. I can already see that I have some wonderful stuff in here. Right. Now you have to be a little bit careful with this, because there are a few things that you can catch in ponds that can bite or hurt you, and there's also a few things that you have to be really careful with handling. So I can see here I've got a pond skater. These guys like to skate on the very surface of the pond. You might have come across them. They're quite a common animal. They're very sweet when you see them up close. I'm going to let him go back because he can quite easily get damaged by the nets and things. So I've got a couple of those. I'll just pop them back in. Lovely animals. I'm just going to pop them back in the water. Okay, now, I don't know if you can see this, but I've got a wonderful dragonfly larvae here, quite a big guy, hiding down there in the corner. Now these guys can bite, so it's best to not handle them directly if you can help it. I've been bitten by them on a few occasions. Not too bad, but it's better to give them a little bit of a wide berth if you don't mind and want a nip. But they are particularly fantastic animals, and as you will probably know, they hatch into wonderful dragonflies that we all love to see. I've also got something rather special in my pond. I have Primate Newts. Here's a little male here. Now these guys are really my favourite thing in this pond. They're meant to be one of the more common newts, Primate Newts. We have 3 native species in the UK. Primate Newts, great crested newts and smooth newts or common newts. This is a lovely, lovely guy. And we also have a few invasive species. But these guys are meant to be quite common, but actually I haven't found them much doing pond surveys. I think they prefer slightly more acidic water, which is what we have up here where I am on Dartmoor. I also have loads and loads of very, very tiny things in here, and I think that the camera's not going to be enough to pick that up. But if you ever do your own pond dipping, you will really be able to see so many tiny, tiny things. Just, it's alive with life. I've got some tiny little chironomids or non-biting midge larvae there, which we almost certainly can't make out, but little tiny squiggly line right by my finger. I have some what are called cladocera, or some people call them water fleas, which are these little tiny dots that are kind of zooming around. They're pretty cool as well. I also have some phantom midge larvae, which are sort of see-through larvae, and they're very exciting. And what I love about doing pond dipping is every single time you do it, you're going to find something different, and you just never get the same things over and over. You can always find a new thing, and the longer that you look, the more different kinds of things you're going to find. And it's worth looking at the plants as well. Macrophytes are what we call these larger plants that are in the water that you can see. It just means large plant. And they are incredible habitat for animals. So I have quite a few in this pond, and I have some problem species as well. I have this blanket weed in the pond, which does kind of grow and cover everything, and it is a habitat, but it can get a bit out of control. So I try and pull as much of that out as I can. You can see I've got a little chironomid larvae just on my finger there. It's going to turn into a fly at some point, so I'll pop him back. And what else have we got in here? So all the other plants that I have around my pond, I've got this amazing flag iris here, which is just absolutely beautiful and a really good source of food for pollinators. I also have this king cup, which is stopped flowering here, but that's a really wonderful plant and also very good for pollinators. And we've got quite a lot of different habitat around the pond. We've got this floating water lily here, and quite a lot of different stuff. So I've got all kinds of things living in my pond. Let's see what else we can find in here. Well, that's good. I've got a bit of light there. I can see. This blanket weed really does sort of smother everything, so it's a bit of a problem species. It's very difficult in ponds because once you get something that you don't want there, it can be quite difficult to get rid of it. You kind of just have to learn to live with it and pull it out as much as you can. There's quite a lot of invasive species in the UK. I found a particularly nasty one in my pond not too long ago. I've just found a mayfly larva. I'm going to see if I can catch it for you. Give you a little show. So, oh, this is a little mayfly larvae. And the way you can tell the difference between mayfly larvae and dragonflies and other sort of larvae is they have this lovely 3-pronged tail that you might be able to see in that shot there. They're a really beautiful animal, and they turn into mayflies, and there's quite a lot of different species. This is probably a common bay today, but I would need my microscope to check. Pop him back in there, or just better eyesight. But every single time I seem to find different stuff. We have some nice pond snails here, so I'm hoping I can find one of them for you. But it does make it difficult to see with this blanket weed. So I've also, one of the problems with ponds is they do need a bit of management, because when you have like a garden pond like I've got here, you get quite a lot of this leaf litter falling in from the trees around, and eventually that kind of builds up and can makes like a layer on the bottom, and that can kind of grow up over time, and then you don't have so much water in the pond. So you do need a little bit of management for ponds. But anything can be a pond. You can have any size. This is a water hog louse I've got here. They're quite sweet. They're very similar to woodlice, but they're the water version. If you know anything about woodlice, you might know that there's a giant marine species that lives in the ocean that's absolutely huge. So they're pretty cool animals. Okay. But yes, you can have anything as a pond. You can even just have like a tiny little water bowl, or just put some water out for things like bees. They like a shallow dish with some stones in so that they don't drown in the water. We've showed you some videos in the past, I think, about smaller ponds and how you can make a pond from even just a washing bowl like this. If you've just got anything, or an old sink, anything animals will love. And different animals like different kinds of ponds. So it's really good to have a variety. You can have a really big pond like this and deep pond, and newts really like this kind of really deep water. But if you have a shallower pond, other animals will prefer that. Things like frogs really need a shallower pond with an area to crawl out on, and they actually often prefer smaller ponds. So they'll really like things like that have an area that they can come up, so that when they're changing from tadpoles into froglets, they can really easily get out the water, and so that the frogs can come in and lay their eggs properly. So frogs like a really shallow pond, and the tadpoles also like quite a lot of sunshine. So you'll see my pond is in shadow at the moment, and most aquatic animals will prefer quite a lot of shading, or prefer a bit of shading at least, so that it's not really hot. Because obviously if it gets really hot, they're not such a big fan of that. But ponds have incredible amount of changes in temperature. So these species are really well adapted to quite extreme conditions. If you think about a larger body of water like a lake or something, the conditions are a lot more stable. So they're going to be able to deal with changes and fluctuations in temperature. And ponds a lot better. It's a much smaller area. So in the summer it can get really quite warm in there. And in the winter it can even freeze. And that's why it's good sometimes to have quite a deep pond, so that things like frogs can hibernate right at the bottom. Especially if you've got fish, you need a really deep pond. There's not that many fish species that are native to ponds that are great to have in there, but we have got quite a few. So if you're interested in having fish in your pond, it's much better to source some native species, things like sticklebacks, tench, crucian carp, that kind of thing, because a lot of the species that you buy for ponds aren't actually very good to have in there. And lots of people say that if you have newts in your pond, frogs in your pond, then it's not a good idea to have fish. That's actually not true if you have native species. That's only true if you've got species from other countries, like the grass carp and things like that people often get for their ponds, koi carp. Those things will eat just about anything. But our native species are much more well adapted to live with newts and frogs. So if you have got fish, or you want fish in your pond, you need a really deep pond, and you also need to make sure that you get some native species. Now there are so many more things in here, but I think that they're so small that showing you might be a little bit difficult. So I'm just going to have one more look. Sorry, I've been mostly staring down into this tank this whole time. I absolutely cannot resist when I do a pond dip to just look right into the depths and see what I can find. It's just such an exciting thing. It's like Christmas every time you do a dip. You can find all kinds of stuff in there. But my animals that I have in here aren't particularly a fan of being held up into the light either. They don't really like that. They'd much prefer to stay in the water. So I'm going to pop them back for now, and I'm going to take you down to my other pond, and we'll see what kind of different animals we have in there. So here we go down. Hopefully my cameraman doesn't fall backwards down the stairs. We'll see how we go. So you can see here I have a very different kind of pond. It's, for a start, much smaller and much shallower. We actually built this for Wild Days, so if you've been watching Wild Days you might have seen the video where we put this one together and I talked to you a bit about ponds then. I have some different species in here, so I have this fantastic Potamogeton. This is a bog pondweed growing in here. This sort of reddish plant. This is a really, really wonderful habitat for lots and lots of insects. These are a really common plant, Potamogeton, in water, also known as the pondweeds, and there's many, many different species. They can look quite different. This one I have only recently managed to get some of this in my pond, and I can see I've got some little flower buds coming up there, so that's really exciting. Hopefully those are going to do well. This is quite a new pond. We only made this pond probably about 3 weeks ago now, and if you can have a look at it, it's really alive with life. And I have to admit, I did add some of this life. So I added these plants from another pond that we have just down the road. All of these plants I've added in, and the moss and things have come from this pond here. But the pond skaters arrived of their own accord. I've got lots of pond skaters on the surface, and that's really the fantastic thing about ponds. So if you make a pond, it will just colonise so quickly. I mean, you'll have stuff living in there in a couple of days, which is really wonderful. We've done quite a lot of research at UCL, which is my old university, on ponds, and they have dug up ponds that haven't been ponds for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they've just dug them out and left them. So they used to be a pond, and they've been filled in for whatever reason, as with the other 500,000 ponds that have been similarly filled in or lost throughout the countryside. But the research shows that if you dig out that pond, the species will recolonise. So the plant seeds will be in the bottom, in the sediment in the bottom of where you dig it out. And once you've dug that out and it starts to fill with water, those plants will come back even hundreds of years after they last growing. So those seeds have a really good potential for staying locked in, and that life to stay locked in. So we do have a great opportunity with ponds to bring them back into our landscape, and they are little oases throughout the landscapes because so many things rely on them. They're such a fantastic sink for nutrients. They're really, really good for capturing carbon. They're really, really important habitats, not just for the animals that live in them that I've shown you a little bit on today, but tons of other animals. Every animal you can think of needs to drink or needs to get to water in some way or some form, and so ponds really provide that, and that's one reason why they're so important. But from a carbon capture point of view, they've been shown to be really important as well. There's loads of research on there, and if you're interested we can, I'm sure, provide you with a bit more information on that. But they're really, really good for capturing species, and they're really important for many species that just live and just rely on ponds. If we lose ponds, we lose so many different species. So if you see in my pond here, I have some tadpoles as well. I've got some lovely tadpoles. And these guys, actually, I have to admit, I did take from another pond. We've never had frogs in here before, so I really, really wanted to make a pond just for frogs. So hopefully they will grow up and then come back to this pond again, and we'll get some. Tadpoles, if you don't know, they can metamorphose really quickly, so you can have them coming up, crawling out really quickly over like a year's cycle, or they can stay in ponds for a much longer period of time. Depends, if they sense that the pond is maybe not that stable and it might dry out, then they'll more quickly change into frogs and move away. But if they sense that actually it's safer to stay in the pond and they've got a really nice environment and habitat there, what they might do is they might stay there for years and years. And so when you're looking, you might find a tadpole that's absolutely huge. And that tadpole could be really quite old. It could have been in that pond for years and years and years, just growing and eating. If it's got a good environment, it's got lots of food, it's got lots of plant matter, they'll really, really do well in that. And they do mostly eat plants, tadpoles, but they will eat a little bit of anything. So you know, if you've got a lot of plant matter and you want some tadpoles, they're pretty fantastic things and very fun to watch. I've got a little group of them here. They really like when the sunshine comes up, and they'll come and they'll come all up to the surface, and you can just see them floating along the top and getting air that way. So they're pretty fantastic creatures. And I really hope that you have a real good interest in ponds like I do. I've even got some little water mint growing here that I didn't sow. That's pretty exciting. I'm just going to show you that. But that's come up more recently. And I'm going to do a little dipping here because I know that I've got some water beetles in here. So I want to see if I can catch them for you. And there's quite a big group of water beetles that live in ponds. They're called ditiscid, diving beetles. And there's lots of other beetles that do live in ponds, but I know that I've got a couple of ditiscids in here, and I want to try and get them for you. But it's a very small pond, and I don't want to squish any of my tadpoles, so I'm going to do a very gentle pond dipping for you and see what I can get out today. Now, these water beetles did also arrive of their own accord, which is very cool. So the only thing I've added to this pond is plants and tadpoles. My sneaky tadpoles. So when you're doing something like this, you want to be really, really gentle. Like, usually I'd be quite vigorous when I'm doing a pond sampling because you want to really get stuff like that up. But I can see that I've got a lot of tadpoles here and I don't want to damage any of them. So I'm just going to do like a really gentle scoop and see what I can get. Well, as predicted, absolutely tons of tadpoles. They are just loving it in this pond. You can see them. Here we go. Okay, so have a look at these guys. This is a really nice plant. This is called hornwort, and you can see that because it has these sort of pronged horns. Here, I don't know if I can show you that. There's a couple of different species, and you can tell from how the little prongs here divide. And it's got these kind of whorls, what we call whorls, this cluster of leaves around along the edge of the leaf. And these are a really fantastic plant because they offer loads of oxygenation. Plants are really brilliant in ponds. Most plants are really brilliant in ponds, I should say, in that they add loads of oxygen to the water. But there are some plants which can get out of control, especially things like, I've got some, these are called lemna, or I think you call these duckweed maybe? I'm not very good on the common names. But these can really grow in huge quantities and block out the light in some cases, and that can be a bit of a problem. We have a few different species of these, and some of them are invasive, and they do tend to get a little bit more out of control, the invasive ones. So that can be a bit of a problem because they can block out the light and shade everything and make it really difficult for other organisms to live in that pond. They can also take up all the oxygen. They live quite quickly and then they die. That's a problem with lots of our microalgae. You might have come across that term before, microalgae. In ponds and in rivers and other systems, they can just bloom and bloom and bloom and be really out of control and change the water to a different colour. You might have even heard of harmful algal blooms where they can be quite toxic, and that's to the things that live in the river, but also if we would go in, or our dogs or anything would go into the water when there's a harmful algal bloom, you can get really poorly from that, get kind of poisoned, which is very nasty. So there are some things in ponds that can be a problem, and this is usually caused by what we call eutrophication, which is when there's too many nutrients going in. We talk about nutrients as being like a really good thing, and nutrients are a really good thing in small quantities, but if you have too much of them, they can start causing really bad problems. So if you get too many nutrients in a pond, those very fast growing plants and algae will just start to grow and grow and grow, and they'll completely take over, and they'll mean that nothing else can really grow there. When they die, they'll use up all the oxygen in the water, so there's no oxygen left for the species that live in the water, and they can be really, really problematic. So it's quite important to understand a bit about chemistry and the ways that ponds work if you want to get the best out of your pond and make sure you've got species that are living and growing. But if you're going to add anything to your pond ever, just make sure it's a native species and that it's used to growing here. And that's really important because these species have evolved together for a really, really long time. So if you put lots of native species together, they're going to work quite well. But if you start introducing stuff from other countries, you just don't know what's going to happen. There are some species that have naturalised here that are totally fine, but there are other species that can become very problematic and can really kind of take over and cause really big problems. So getting a bit distracted from my pond dipping there, but just going to see what else I can find for you in here. You can see these lovely, lovely tadpoles. I mean, they're one of my favourite things to see. We have a bit of a, I'd not say hard time, but frogs don't seem to really like this area that much. I'm not quite sure why, but we used to have loads of frogs here, and both me and my neighbour have been talking about how we just haven't really seen them around. There's loads down that way, and there's some up that way, but this sort of section seems to have missed out on the frogs. So I'm hoping we can bring frogs back to the area. We definitely have really good habitat for them here. There's lots of food available. We don't use any chemicals or anything in our garden, which is incredibly important if you want amphibians, so frogs and newts and things, because they have this very permeable skin, and so if you're using chemicals and things, that can really cause a huge problem for them. They're really, really susceptible to diseases and lots of different things, so amphibians are really quite sensitive animals in a lot of ways. They can kind of be like the canary in the coal mine if you have a problem with stuff disappearing. Oh, I've got a little pond skater there, sorry pal. See this guy. I mean, when you see these up close, they're just so beautiful. I really wish I could show you stuff under a microscope, because when you look at some of the textures and colours on these guys, they're just wonderful animals. They've got these two eyes here, and they've got a long siphon that they tuck down by their belly. They're really quite special. And these are ferocious predators, so lots of things in the pond are predators. It's a really dynamic, changeable, quite aggressive environment. He does not want to go. Did he go? So the dragonfly larvae I sent you earlier will be really, really, really aggressive, and they just eat everything. They're real hunters. They're kind of like the top predators of the pond. But there's lots of things that will eat stuff in ponds. So I've got, and so everything's either quite quick, like it will be there for a bit and then it will move on quite quickly. It will just have its larval stage here, like tadpoles and like a lot of the fly larvae and things. But the things that live there all the time are pretty well adapted. And almost everything that's in ponds will fly as well, because they'll need to kind of move on and go to another habitat, so they'll need that adaptation. So those pond skaters, they can fly and move on. And that's why they're quite quick to colonise. And I didn't show you, but I do have some pond swimmers, like back swimmers. You might have seen them. They kind of hang upside down in the water surface. We call those notonectidae. They have quite a lot of common names. So you might have seen them, and they're really, really strong predators, but they'll fly. If you ever catch them in your pond dipping, you might see them. They kind of come and they go upright onto the surface, and then they'll suddenly just take off and be gone. So they're quite fun, but they also can sting, so you've got to be really careful if you come across them. I don't think I've managed to capture any beetles this time, but there are some really fantastic water beetles, and some of them get really big. I have caught the greater diving beetle, and that gets to like as big as a newt, bigger than a newt. They're really quite incredible creatures. Just going to pop my tadpoles back. I think we are coming to the end of the half hour now. I wanted to say thank you very much for listening to me blather on about ponds for half an hour. I hope you can tell that they're a bit of a passion subject for me. I've definitely grown up almost living in one, and I just love being beside them and finding what's in them. And there's such fascinating places. I think it's horrendously sad that we've lost so many from our landscape, and that people don't seem to value them as they do, and that there's so many chemicals and nutrients going into them that are really affecting them. They're quite sensitive environments, and they can be affected by different things quite quickly. So I really, really urge you to check out the Naturehood website. There's some fantastic tips on how you can make your own pond. And I think if you're making your own pond, it's really important to also go pesticide free. There's so many things in the water that can get affected by these chemicals, and also by nutrients if you're using fertilizers, strong fertilizers and things like that. So I think it's incredibly important to follow some of the guidance that Naturehood have, and just make sure that you have a very, very wildlife friendly garden like we have here. So thank you and goodbye.